The Jews have been taken captive out of Judah, and they've been captive in the Babylonian Empire for many, many years. It's become the Babylonian Empire, and then it belonged to the Medes and Persians, and finally just to the Persians. And Nehemiah was a young man who hadn't ever been to Jerusalem. He had never seen Judah. His people were part of the captives, and he'd grown up in a foreign country. But he was a fine young man, and he was the cupbearer for the king. And Ahasuerus the king liked Nehemiah. And Nehemiah would come in bearing the food and the drink, and what he had to do was to taste it first. If it didn't kill Nehemiah, then it would be okay for the king to eat it or drink it. Well, Nehemiah was very trusted. And one time, Nehemiah's brothers left, and they went all the way, some almost 2,000 miles, back to Judah to see the city of Jerusalem that had been just left in a shambles. And that's what was left. The temple had been burned down, and Zerubbabel had tried to rebuild it, but there were no walls around Jerusalem. And it was an absolute disaster, and nobody lived in the city. And when the brothers came back, they went to Nehemiah, and Nehemiah said, tell me about Jerusalem. What was it like? God's city. And the brothers said, oh, Nehemiah, it's awful. The walls are down. There's trash all over everywhere. They've tried to rebuild the temple, and the rest of the city is just a mess. It's a disgrace. And Nehemiah said, oh, that's so sad. It makes me really feel bad. And that night, he went to sleep. Before he went to sleep, he began to pray, and he told God he was sorry, to forgive his sins and the sins of his people, and that he would really wanted to do something about it. And he said, God, I want to go do something about Jerusalem. I love Nehemiah. Nobody asked him to do it. It wasn't his responsibility. He wasn't a builder. He'd never been to Jerusalem. He just knew it was God's city and it desperately needed help. And Nehemiah didn't have to be asked to do it. He went to the king the next morning, and the king looked at him and he said, Nehemiah, what's wrong? You look sad and you always look happy. And Nehemiah said, well, King, I'm sorry. And he sort of prayed without saying anything out loud that God would help him. And he said, I'm really sad because God's city, Jerusalem, the walls are down and nobody's living in it, and it's a mess. It just makes my heart break. And Ahasuerus said, well, is there something you want to do about it, Nehemiah? And Nehemiah said, yes, I'd like to go back and rebuild the walls. Would you let me do that, Ahasuerus? And Ahasuerus said, well, will you come back after you finish rebuilding the walls? And Nehemiah said, absolutely. I promise I'll come back. And Ahasuerus said, okay, then I'll let you go. Is there anything else I can do for you? And Nehemiah said, well, actually there is. Could you give me a letter to give to all the people along the way that says they should give me wood and gold and silver and whatever else I might need to help rebuild those walls? And Ahasuerus said, I not only will do that with the letter, but I'm going to give you a bunch of soldiers to go with you, and they can help. Oh, Nehemiah was so thrilled to take on a job that he knew nothing about doing, that was a terrible mess, in a city where he'd never been, instead of staying in the palace and in the comfort of being the king's cupbearer with good clothes and good food. And Nehemiah took the letter, and he took the soldiers, and off they went on that long, long journey to Jerusalem. And they got there at night. And so Nehemiah said to everybody, just go to bed. We aren't going to do anything about it tonight. But he got on his horse, and he began to ride around the city. And he looked at the places where the walls were completely down. And he looked to see where there were no walls at all. And places where he couldn't even walk because of the trash. He'd have to go down the hill and around the other way. And the next morning when he got up, he called all of the people that were Jews together. And he said, listen, Jerusalem is a mess. It's a disgrace. And it's a disgrace not only to you, but it's going to be a disgrace to your children. Now let's do something about it. Let's rebuild these walls. And the people got all excited and they said, we'll do it. We'll rebuild the walls. And he said, all right, and that means everybody has to go to work. He had the perfume maker helping to build walls. He had the priest. He had the musicians. He had the daughter of the mayor. He had all kinds of people, the goldsmith. All of them are working to rebuild the walls. Well, you know the devil's not going to let that go by without doing something about it. There were two fellows with really funny names, Sanballat and Tobiah, and their friend Gershom the Arab. They came around to make fun of the wall, and they said, yeah, 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 you can't build a wall. That wall is no good. Why, if a fox ran over the top of it, it would all fall down. And Nehemiah just said, don't pay attention, keep building. And they kept building. Now, that wasn't easy. When people make fun of you, you want to retaliate. But Nehemiah's group didn't. They just kept right at their job. So Sanballat and Tobiah went back and they thought, well, we'll have to do something else. That didn't work. So they said, we'll write a letter. We'll write a letter back to the king and we'll tell him that Nehemiah is building this wall because he wants to secede from his empire and he's not going to pay taxes anymore. Now, that was all a lie, but that's what they wrote. They came back and told Nehemiah, we're sending a letter to the king that says you're building the wall so you can secede from his government and not pay taxes. And Nehemiah said, don't pay attention to him. That's a lie. The king's not going to believe that. Just keep on building. Keep on building. So they all kept right on building. Sanballat and Tobiah went back and they said, okay, that hasn't worked. So what else can we do? Well, they said, we can attack. So they said, okay, let's attack. Let's all of us get swords. We'll get a group of people to go with us and we'll attack them. Nehemiah got word about that, and he said to the people, okay, everybody put on a sword. We'll put a trumpeter up on the wall. The rest of you keep building, and if the trumpet's blown, then you know to take out your sword and fight. Otherwise, we just keep building. Well, when Sanballat and Tobiah got there and saw that these people are all working on the wall with swords on, ready to fight, and a trumpeter up on the wall who's ready to let them know, they got scared. Silly, foolish guys. And they left and went back. Now, in the meantime, 52 days later, Nehemiah and all of these people had finished building the walls. And Sanballat and Tobiah said, now we can't get into Jerusalem and steal stuff anymore. Now the city is safe because it has a wall around it. Let's make friends with them. We'll pretend that we're going to be buddies. We'll sign a peace treaty. They've been signing peace treaties for years, and they've never worked. And so they went to send a message to Nehemiah, and they said, Nehemiah, you've built a beautiful wall, and we see that it's finished, and we live here in the valley, and you all are going to be living up there in the mountain in Jerusalem. We need to shake hands and sign a peace treaty. And Nehemiah said, I don't have time for peace treaties. You can't sign a peace treaty with the devil. It just doesn't work. And Nehemiah refused. He finished the walls, and then they counted, and every 10th family had to move back into Jerusalem to live so that there would be somebody living in the city. And when the wall was finished, they had a big feast. Ezra came out and read the law, and Zerubbabel wasn't that a funny thing to say? Zerubbabel. Roll that around in your mouth a time or two. But that was his name. They all came out, and they were excited and filled with joy because the temple was done, and the walls were up, and they had succeeded, and everybody had worked together. And when it was completely finished, Nehemiah said, now I have to leave. I'm going back because I promised Ahasuerus I would return. And maybe he'll let me come back later and be the governor. Well, Nehemiah went back, told Ahasuerus they had finished the walls, and then he asked Ahasuerus, would it be all right if I went back to be the governor of Jerusalem? And Ahasuerus said, yes, it would be all right. We'll miss you, but you go back and take care of God's city. And that's exactly what Nehemiah did. But the thing I love so much about Nehemiah is that nobody had to tell him. Nobody had to ask him. God had to ask Moses to go release the people from Egypt. God has over and over again asked people. He asked Jonah, and Jonah didn't want to do it. God has to ask. But he didn't have to ask Nehemiah. Now, wouldn't it be wonderful if Mama didn't have to say, it's time for you to walk the dog, or the teacher didn't have to say, did you bring your homework in today? Or Daddy didn't have to say, well, there sure are a lot of leaves out there on the driveway. Somebody needs to sweep that off. Nobody had to ask Nehemiah to do something. He just did it because it needed to be done. And if you want to be a Nehemiah and a real leader, then you need to learn now to do what needs to be done without having to be asked.